Okay, what is going on, everyone? I want to welcome you all to this very highly anticipated segment of the Science Applied series. I'm actually planning to do a bunch more episodes in this series moving forward. So I think I'm going to do another cycle of push-pull legs after this one. And then I'll probably do a couple upper-lower workouts and then probably an arm workout. So if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of those videos. But this one has been a long time coming. So let's go ahead and dig right in with this workout. So up first is a 5 to 10 minute warm-up. I think it's really important to not skip your warm-up on leg day, since it really does seem to reduce your risk of injury and also increase performance. One 2006 review found that of the 5 studies they examined, 3 showed a positive effect of warming up on injury reduction, and the 2 that didn't show a preventative effect just focused too much on stretching over just raising core body temperature. So after 10 minutes on the elliptical, I just got into my usual dynamic stretching and light foam rolling routine, and you can watch my warm-up Science Explained video for more detail on that. So we're kicking off the workout with 3 sets of 4 to 6 reps on the squat, leaving 2 to 3 reps in the tank here. And while the squat may not be the best glute exercise from an activation perspective, the hip thrust is a bit better. If I had to pick just one of these as an overall lower body mass builder, I think I would go with the squat, just because it has such a much larger range of motion and just activates more lower body musculature overall. So as usual, you'll want to pyramid up in weight to a heavy working weight that you'll do your 3 straight working sets with. So in terms of setup, the first thing we'll cover is bar placement. So should you squat high bar with the bar resting up on your traps, or should you squat low bar with the bar resting down on your rear delts? Of course, high bar is the placement I'm using here, and that's mostly just because I find it puts a little less strain on my lower back and my wrists. And even though I personally think people make a bit of too much of a big deal out of this, biomechanical analysis does suggest that the high bar squat might emphasize the quads more due to a greater moment arm at the knee joint, and a low bar squat may emphasize the glutes more due to a larger moment at the hips. And this is supported by a 2017 review, which notes that those seeking to develop the posterior chain musculature, like the glutes, may want to use the low bar back squat, while those seeking contribution from the quadriceps may seek to use the high bar squat. Now, an obvious drawback of the high bar squat is that pretty much everyone is weaker using that variation, since your upper back muscles will become a limiting factor at a certain point. But I'm not sure that as bodybuilders, the absolute load we're using is even really all that relevant, since progressive overload is the main thing driving hypertrophy. As long as you're getting progressively stronger on the squat, I don't think it really matters too much whether you're using high bar or low bar. So in my general coaching recommendations, I just say to just squat using whatever bar placement feels most comfortable to you. So you'll want 2 to 3 shallow steps back to minimize energy loss on the way out, and then take a deep breath deep into your stomach using the Valsalva maneuver. So basically just hold the breath on the way down and for most of the way up, and then as you break through the top half of the concentric, you can exhale your air. This will increase intra-abdominal pressure and force transfer, allowing you to move heavier weights. However, some research has shown this technique to increase blood pressure during lifting. So while it's extremely common in powerlifting, you'll want to use it at your own discretion. Now, in terms of squat depth, one 2013 study compared quad hypertrophy over 12 weeks using a shallow, quarter squat, or a deep squat, and found that the deep squat outperformed the shallow squat at every single quad site measured. So when it comes to the quads, squatting deep is the way to go. And an earlier paper from Catarasano et al. Showed that increased squat depth correlated perfectly in tandem with increased glute activation. So activation increased as you went from a partial to a parallel to a full squat. However, it's important to keep in mind that this study may have been confounded by using absolute loading. So in other words, the subjects were using the same loads across all 3 variations. So the deep squat might have just resulted in more glute activation simply because deep squats are harder. A later 2016 study looking at the same question used relative loading instead, and they didn't find much difference between a parallel squat and a full ass to grass squat. So I'd say the best recommendation is to simply squat as deep as you comfortably can, and the benefits of going past parallel are probably not worth sacrificing your technique and mobility capabilities for. And I think that in general, you should just squat with a stance that feels most comfortable to you and one that allows you to lift the most weight. Just how wide that is will depend mostly on your bone structure and is something you'll just have to experiment with. Research has shown similar levels of quad activation between a narrow stance and a wide stance, but glute activation really does seem to increase with a wider stance. So if you're trying to build the glutes as your main priority, you might want to consider using a wider stance, but for the quads, it really just doesn't seem to matter. Now, the last thing I want to cover on the squat is butt wink. So butt wink is what you're seeing right here at the bottom of the squat, where my lower back starts to round a little bit and my butt kind of tucks in under my hips. Whether or not this is dangerous and should be eliminated is actually not really agreed upon in the scientific community. You have one camp of practitioners who argue for the flexibility theory, so the idea that tight muscles are causing the pelvis to be sort of pulled posteriorly, and to fix that, you need to stretch out those muscles. Usually it's the hamstrings or the calves. Now, I'm not much of a believer of the flexibility theory myself. I tend to lean more toward the structural theory camp, which argues that butt wink is ultimately determined by your skeleton. So as you go deeper in the squat, the pelvis is simply forced to rotate posteriorly because the head of the femur basically just runs out of room as it rotates in the hip socket, which causes the lower back to round a little bit as well. And the current consensus amongst most strength professionals seems to be that the fear over butt wink is a little bit overhyped. It doesn't seem that having a little bit of butt wink will severely increase your injury risk, but just how much is too much is difficult to say based on the current literature. My personal advice is to limit your depth to the point where your lower back just starts to round. And if you struggle with hitting depth without any butt wink, consider experimenting with different stance widths, using a shoe with an elevated heel, or try some stretches for your calf muscles, as that does seem to help quite a lot of people in terms of ankle mobility. Okay, so up next, we're doing 3 sets of 8 reps on the Romanian deadlift. And we're basically including this as a second compound movement because as shown in this 2009 study, out of the 6 lower body movements tested, the squat ranked by far in dead last place for hamstrings activation. So we're not getting much hamstring work out of the squat. And despite the fact that isolation movements tend to come out on top for the hamstrings, we should also include a hip extension based lift like the Romanian deadlift because of the very large degree of stretch on the hamstrings, with stretch being a potentially valuable factor in terms of anabolic signaling. That's also a good idea to combine hip extension and knee flexion-based movements because, as shown in this 2013 study, the leg curl is slightly better at activating the outer hamstrings, while the Romanian deadlift is better for hitting the inner hamstrings. So using a combination of these is best for overall hamstrings development. Now, as for a progression scheme, one thing I've been experimenting with lately for Romanian deadlifts is keeping the weight the exact same and just adding 1 rep every week. The reason I've been favoring this for RDLs is that I've always found that once I get to a certain weight, or once a weight gets past a certain point, my lower back and glutes just start to take over, and I just can't get that same mind-muscle connection or feeling of stretch on the hamstrings, which is the whole point of the exercise. So what you want to do is find the most weight that you can do 8 reps with and still feel a solid stretch in your hamstrings and a mind-muscle connection. And then each week you'll use that same weight, but simply add 1 rep. And you can just keep doing that as the weeks go by, all the way up to, say, 12 reps or even more. And then this way you still get that same progressive overload without having to load the movement so heavily that your hamstrings get overpowered by other muscles. Okay, so up next, you can optionally include 2 to 3 sets of walking lunges for 20 total strides. So that's 10 reps on each leg. And if you're more of a beginner or an early intermediate, you can go ahead and skip these if you like. The volume might be a little bit redundant. And now there isn't a ton of literature on this movement, but when it has been studied, it's consistently shown impressive results for the entire lower body. For example, in this 2009 study, you can see that it actually had a slight edge on the squat for vastus lateralis, or outer sweep activation. It's clearly great for the glutes, and it isn't too bad for the hamstrings either. So here you want to drive your leading heel through the floor, and you want to minimize contribution from your back leg so that every rep is intentional, and you're minimizing forward momentum from the rear leg. Also, you just get such a great stretch on the glutes through such a big range of motion, and while muscle soreness really doesn't seem to be a driver of hypertrophy, I think it can be useful as an indicator of muscle activation, and in my experience, really nothing seems to get my glutes sore quite like these high rep walking lunges. So up next, we're doing single leg extensions for 3 sets of 10 reps on each leg. And the reason we're training each leg individually is because, in my experience, this is the best way to avoid asymmetries. You may notice that when you do both legs at once, usually one leg will contribute a little bit more than the other. So doing these single-legged basically ensures that both quads are receiving the exact same amount of tension. And remember that research shows that vastus lateralis, or outer sweep activation, is higher with the toes pointed in. So if you're looking to hit the quad sweep more, consider pointing the toes in. But the activation differences here are actually pretty small, so I think you should more or less use a foot position that just feels comfortable for you and focus on controlled, mindful contractions. And up next, we're doing 3 sets of 8 plus 4 reps on the single leg lying leg curl. Again, we're doing these unilaterally to avoid left to right imbalances. And one thing we're doing here that's a little different is altering ankle position for the last 4 reps to help extend the set. So for the first 8 reps, you want to plantar flex or point your toes down, and this will take the gastroc muscle of the calf out of involvement, basically forcing the hamstrings to do the brunt of the work. And once you reach failure or near failure on that 8th rep, immediately dorsiflex or point your toes up, and that'll get the gastroc more involved and allow your calves to sort of assist the hamstrings with knee flexion. So I like to think of this strategy as a sort of biomechanical forced rep. When you point your toes up, your calves will help you get an extra 4 reps or so. Also, I think it's important to remember that one of the 4 hamstrings muscles, the biceps femoris short head, doesn't even cross the hip joint, meaning it can only be trained through knee flexion movements. So Romanian deadlifts really can't hit this muscle. You simply have to curl in order to build it. So up next are 2 calf exercises. First, we're doing 3 sets of 10 to 12 reps on the single leg press calf raise. And this will target both the soleus and the gastrocnemius. And this has all been covered in a lot of detail in my Calf Science Explained video, so I'll also have that one linked in the description. And for our second calf movement, we're gonna be doing 3 sets of 20 reps on the seated calf raise machine. Being a bent leg movement, this will preferentially target the deeper, but actually bigger soleus muscle. And even though the research isn't perfectly clear on whether high rep training is better for targeting slow twitch muscle fibers, I think there is a strong theoretical basis for it. So I'm still of the opinion that high rep work is better for working this very typically slow twitch dominant soleus. And the main thing you'll want to focus on here is intentionally pausing at the bottom of every rep, basically allowing the elastic energy in the Achilles tendon to dissipate so that the actual calf muscles are in fact doing the work. All right, so guys, that's gonna wrap up this Science Applied Leg Day. I hope you guys really liked it. I'm gonna be at the Toronto Pro Show Expo this weekend, so June 2nd and June 3rd. So if you happen to be around, make sure you come and say hello. I'd love to get to meet some more of you guys. And before we go, I wanna thank Audible for sponsoring this video. One question that I get asked all the time is what books I read. And since it's not always easy to be reading when you're kind of traveling and on the go, Audible has been my source of audiobooks for the last 3 or 4 years, just because I find it to be so convenient. So I've been listening to the book Sapiens by Yuval Harari. I think I'm saying that right, and it's really interesting so far. So if you guys would like to get started with an exclusive free 30-day trial and your free book of choice, you can go to audible.com/Jeff Nippard, or if you text Jeff Nippard to 500-500, you can get started right away. And I'll have that linked as the first link down there in the description, and it comes very highly recommended. So make sure you go and check out Audible. So thank you, Audible, so much for supporting the video and the channel. I really appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys all here for the next Science Applied video, and I think it's gonna be a new push day. So I'll see you all then.